where we are at with the Paris Agreement and livestock in the region, despite the importance of the sectors in contributing towards emissions, I just wanted to highlight here that of all the 33 countries, you have about 32 that have submitted their NDCs to UNFCCC, and of these, only 13 have mentioned livestock. Okay. Within this, you have only 2 countries that have mentioned mitigation and 9 that have mentioned that have included adaptation. And this is obviously understandable because the countries are exposed to climate change. So these 2 countries that have included mitigation in their NDCs are Brazil and Uruguay. And they're the only 2 countries that have included quantifiable targets. All other countries have just, have included, those that have included livestock have said they will use livestock as, as a mitigation adaptation tool, but they have not said by how much the sector will contribute, or they haven't said, how they're going to do it. So despite the importance, I think there's still a lot of work to be done on this, making sure that the countries understand that livestock is important and that livestock can play a key role in helping them meet their targets, their climate change targets, and this is something that we need to work on. So just very quickly, so we know that this sector will continue to play a key role, both domestically and globally. When we look at the cattle sector, the emissions are high, emission intensities are high, and that there are opportunities that we can harvest in order to address the key challenges. I think I will. How much time do I have? Okay, I'll just continue. So I just want to quickly touch on some of the pathways that we feel are important for the sector, and we've had a lot about some of these things this morning. So here we have 3 main pathways that we are promoting. So improving efficiency across the supply chains. So we are not just talking about looking at the farmer, in spite of the fact that the farmer, at the farm is where you have most emissions. In order to improve, efficiency, I mean, we need also to focus on the other parts of the supply chain. And it's not only the cattle producer, but we also need to look at the feed producer to see, what is it. That's why the life cycle, approach is very important. We also need to think about, how best is it improving logistics, transport, after the farm gate, improving processing, because this is where also we can reduce emissions. But obviously the largest part of the emissions are at the farm. Enhancing and maintaining soil carbon, Walter touched on that already, and looking at the livestock's role in the bioeconomy. I'm going to go through each of these points. So the first pathway, improving efficiency across supply chains. With this pathway, improving efficiency can result in emission reductions, but also emission intensity reductions. And once you decrease emissions, as we've seen before, is decreasing emissions via productivity is strongly linked with food security, as well as rising incomes and system resilience. One thing that is important to note is that it really matters how you approach this emission reduction. So where you have your sector expanding, when I say sector expanding, meaning if you add more animals to the herd, at the minimum what you will do is that you will reduce emissions below the business as usual scenario. If you keep your herds constant or you reduce the number of animals in your herd, what you're going to have is not only an emission intensity reduction, but also an absolute emission reduction. So basically, the first point there is what we would want to see. but it's not always possible because in some cases you may need to expand the herd. I'm not going to go through that figure because we don't have time, but you can. Sorry. So very quickly on some of the options. If we are looking at the technical options on the farm. We've heard about technologies and practices that can enhance efficiency, and not only looking at the animal level, but also at the entire herd level. I saw things like improving your feed, using additives, improved genetics, animal health, animal management, and husbandry. All these can decrease emission intensity via productivity gains. I just mentioned the need to promote efficient logistics services and infrastructure, so transport, storage, slaughterhouses, processing units. And one publication from the World Bank has shown that it's a study that was done by the World Bank have shown that there is a need in the region to address the constraint of high logistic costs. For example, it showed that logistic costs as a proportion of the total value of products in Latin America is between 18% and 32% compared to the 9% in OECD countries. And obviously there is a need to develop efficient markets, for both for inputs, so what is going on to the farm, but also outputs, because you're not going to ask producers to produce more and yet they're not able to access markets. This is important. Otherwise they don't pick up the practices and they don't change. So they need to have access to markets. So very quickly, this is a study that we have done on Uruguay that shows the impacts on enteric methane, emission intensity, and productivity. I think Walter mentioned some of these interventions. These are single interventions, but what you can see is that the potential is quite high. I mean, with the various interventions. This is a modeling exercise that we've done under a certain project. So some of the recommended actions is basically for this pathway is identifying feasible, cost-effective technologies. Not everything works everywhere, so we need to be able to identify what works in what situation, and then providing incentives in order for farmers to adopt these interventions. There is a need of obviously for access to finance to address the upfront costs that are associated with adopting technologies. We need to better align the incentives and that are provided with best practices. I mean, let's not just subsidize. Let's subsidize best practices. Traceability, certification schemes, development of premium markets. This is important because otherwise why are you asking farmers to produce better? There has to be something that goes back to the farmer. Improving efficiency of markets and logistic systems is also one of those actions. So pathway 2, enhancing and maintaining soil carbon. I will skip this slide because it's quite general. But what we know is that as a sector that is important in the region, about 70% of the areas in Latin America they are under the process of degradation. This is just a few examples that we have over here, and we have carried out a study that shows that there is a lot of potential in Latin America. The potential is about 30% of what we estimated at the global level, and here what we did is basically we tested improved grazing management. So the potential is there, but there are problems obviously with soil carbon. So what are some of the pathways that entry points when we talk about soil carbon? And here I mentioned three main ones that are important for Latin America. So on degraded pastures, the adoption of regenerative practices that can restore productivity of the degraded land, so fertilization, reseeding, etc. In grasslands that have sufficient productive potential, it's important to pasture intensification is important. So sowing of improved pasture species, fertilization, irrigation, electric fences, provision of water, and so on. And in the forest areas, let's not forget that livestock or cattle are usually used in pushing the agricultural frontier. So it's important that we also take that into account and not forget that that livestock is a driver of deforestation. So, addressing the pressure that livestock can have on these ecosystems is important. So taking into account also, the other dynamics, so the energy, the crop dynamics, making sure that the incentive structures are in place, for example, subsidies, regulations, the monitoring of and markets as well. I will skip that because I'm short of time. So some of the recommended actions. Addressing the barriers to adoption again of improved practices, so making sure that you have in place credit schemes, finance, access to knowledge and technical services, availability of inputs. We also need to ensure that there is a coherence between sectoral policies and strategies, because you find, for example, in the case of deforestation, you find forestry being forestry policies do not incorporate issues related to livestock, and yet if livestock is a key driver, livestock should have a say during the design of these sectoral policies. Removal of incentives for land occupation, especially where you have this risk of deforestation. So elimination or reform of incentive schemes, secure land tenure. And again, developing tools and mechanisms to monitor and implementation of best practices and enforcement of regulation. I think this is very important. It has shown that it can work, but it needs to be expanded a little bit more. And then supporting and the development and upscale of cost-effective emission reduction measurements. This is particularly relevant for the soil carbon because we would need to prove that you have sequestered carbon, and at the moment it is difficult to monitor and to measure, and this is some of the things that we're working on. The bioeconomy, so we know that livestock uses a lot of biomass, but also at the same time demand is growing, so the key question is where is the biomass going to come from in order to produce the amount of product that is demanded. What we know is that the current biomass is basically underexploited. There are many waste streams that can be brought back and can be used. You also have, there's more feed and other products for other processes can be extracted from the currently existing biomass. And in many cases, biomass can be upgraded, by increasing current yields or closing the yield gaps. This is just an example. This is an analysis that we did in order to understand, just various types of biomass that we have in the region, and its use. So in terms of crop residues, you can see that about 28% of that is used in feed. The rest is going to conservation, agriculture. Crop residues are left on some part of that is burnt. Obviously, the choices that you make, there will definitely be trade-offs. Whether you want to feed the crop residues to the animals, or you would want to plow it back, into the soil. In terms of agro-industrial byproducts, you have quite amount, 880 million tons available within the region from various sources of processes in the region. However, you have only 12% that is going into feed. When we look at nitrogen, so we have manure. A lot of that is actually deposited on grassland, and you may argue that it is not available for use, but it does also play a role. It depends also on how you manage your grazing systems. But I just want to highlight the fact that you're producing about 22 million tons of nitrogen that is excreted in the region. And the regional consumption of synthetic N is about 8.4 million tons. So that tells something. Food losses and waste. Food losses and waste. This is a big thing here and all over the world. I mean, it's become important, and in some regions, this is being recycled back into the food system. Obviously, there has to be in place regulation and incentives and all. It's not that straightforward to do this, but I just want to say how much is being lost. So it's about 120 million tons is wasted. 127, sorry, and then you have about that is an equivalent of about 125 million hectares of land that was used to produce that which is not consumed. So you also have, with that comes emissions, because this produces emissions. So this is a case study that we put together for Brazil, and it focuses on the rendering industry. So what is it that you can use? It shows how much is being used from the rendering industry and where it's going back. So you're producing about 12.3 million tons of side streams, and this is just, I think, one. It's not the total industry in Brazil, but out of this, part of that is going into feed use, so nutrients for feed, so 60% of that. You have a part that is being used for pet food as well, and part that is used into going fat and tallow that is used for biofuel production, and the rest is going to the hygiene and cleaning production sector. This is a very good example of what we refer to as a circular bioeconomy. It's not easy to set up this type of model of business, but we should be thinking in terms of how best we can bring back what we thought was waste back into the system. And it also has other benefits, the socioeconomic benefits, so more jobs, and also in terms of how much is gained and exported in terms of export. So when we talk about the circular bioeconomy, we think about it in various levels. It can be applied at various levels. It can be applied at the farm level, where you are, and this is the part that I think we are more conversant with, where we are making use of these biological processes, reconnecting and reintegrating various systems such as the mixed crop livestock systems. You can think of it also at the regional level and landscape level, where we were taking into account, trying to enhance the synergies between beyond the farm level through cooperation between crop and livestock farmers, or between livestock farms as well and other industries, in order to optimize the use of biomass. Also across the supply chain, so as a private sector, we should also be thinking about, what is it that we can harness from the other from the other agents in the supply chain. So promoting synergies within and between supply chains in order to reuse biomass. So for example, here an example is piggeries using whey from the cheese factories. And another question I have is whether we can promote this at the international level. And the question is, what does it mean? Does it mean that we should be adding more value at the production location rather than just exporting the raw product? And here an example is beef versus soybean exports from Latin America to Europe or to any other country. I mean, this is out for debate. So some of the recommended actions is we need to better understand what the potential is in order to set up the circular bioeconomy. What are the synergies and the trade-offs? It's important to highlight this the issue of trade-offs, because whatever choices you make will definitely involve trade-offs. We need changes in regulation in order to upscale these flows of biomass. And a lot of the outcomes that we will see will depend on the rules and the regulations that are put in place. Research, definitely, and knowledge is necessary for the development of market for alternative materials, and catalyzing investment in new business models and innovation, because this circular bioeconomy means new models, new way of doing things. What are some of the essential qualities of a low carbon strategy? And here I try to outline, what I feel as some of these. I feel one is that it should be country owned and country driven, because otherwise we do not want to be imposing things on countries. So what this means is public support. It also means that it has to reflect all stakeholder views. We've had a lot about multi-stakeholder this morning. It has to be integrated in existing plans and strategies, so it is not a standalone. It means that they have to, these two things have to work together. It has to be analytically sound. It has to build on sound analysis, assumptions, and tools, because otherwise then we are just guessing. It has to be comprehensive, so taking into account all the development objectives of a country and stakeholder perspectives. Forward-looking, because a lot of the decisions that we make will impact emissions for a very long time. So it means that the sector has to have a vision. So where do we want the sector to go? Without a vision, I think we don't have it. It also has to be actionable. It has to be a plan whereby different stakeholders can take up different paths and basically run with it and implement it. And it has to be transformative. We don't want to see, incremental improvements. We want to see major improvements in the sector. So how do we move forward? We need consensus. We need consensus on the problems and main solutions among the main actors. We also need to have high-level commitment. We need our governments behind us. We need to make sure that we are capturing all the perspectives, producers and consumers, and we've seen that a lot of the discussions today were also about that. Communication, we need to maintain a positive and marketable image of the sector if we want to move forward. A lot of pressure is on the sector, and this is the time that this is the time to bring everything together. And we need to recognize that we need differentiated national action in each systems. It's not going to be a global strategy. It'll have to be national. You can have regional overall action plans, but most of the strategies have to be national because of the diversity. I've already mentioned that we need to have this menu of technologies and practices, and also promote those with adequate policies and institutions, incentives and all. And we need, a collaboration on things such as, evaluation methods and data. I'm sorry for having rushed through my presentation, but I would like to say thank you.